I want to welcome Louise Work Havelund. She comes from the Danish Built Heritage, and she is a senior consultant, and she will, I think, tell a little bit about transmission of churches. Is that right?
Yes.
So, welcome.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Louise, and I want to start out by saying that I don't normally have to talk about my work in English, so you'll have to forgive me if I sort of read my notes really carefully, because I've been translating like a crazy person in order to turn this project into English so that you could all understand what it's about. But yes, I work for a private consultancy, and we do projects for municipalities and government agencies and organizations and other people. And the projects we do are related to the reuse of built heritage and the transformation of the built environment as such. So we do projects that could, focus on a single building like an old factory, and we also do projects that look at sort of more large-scale municipal planning. So from the small to the very large. We analyze both sort of the physical stuff, the physical structures that architects would normally look at, but we also look at the social, the cultural and the financial aspects of having to reuse or transform a building or a city area. So we also help our clients build sustainable business models. And we design the process, we make sure that the right people come together, residents, owners, investors, municipalities and all that. This particular project on Danish churches, or actually Danish church buildings, we did for a big foundation called Cradle. It's a Danish foundation that supports projects in the built environment. And Cradle wanted to look at what kind of built heritage is it exactly that we have in Denmark when we talk about our church buildings. Because, as some of you might know, the first 6 churches have actually closed in Copenhagen. I know that this is also closed, but the big sort of news in Copenhagen is that it's state churches. In Denmark we have like a state religion. So it's 6 of those churches have closed in Copenhagen now, and this is a completely new situation, because I think over the last 100 years in Denmark we've closed maybe 9 or 10 churches or something like that. So compared to Holland and England, where they do this all the time, this is a completely new situation in Denmark. So Cradle wanted to sort of get an overview of, so this built mass of church buildings, what exactly is it that we're dealing with here, and how can we preserve and reuse and transform this built heritage if in the future we are going to see a lot more closing of churches. So just to sort of bring you really briefly up to speed on what the big challenge is, it is that demographic changes in Denmark is putting a lot of pressure on the church's economy. We're seeing a depopulation of rural areas. As some of you might know, there's a huge urbanization wave happening. So a lot of people are actually leaving the smaller villages in the rural areas of Denmark. And this means that a lot of churches are almost empty. Every Sunday they're not really being used. And actually the same problem we have in Copenhagen. And that's why 6 churches have closed there, because even though Copenhagen is growing, sort of the old inner city neighborhoods, they're actually much lessly dense populated now than 100 years ago. There's a neighborhood in Copenhagen called Vesterbro, and 100 years ago in Vesterbro there was 80,000 people living there, and now there's 35,000 people living there. So you can imagine that the need for churches in sort of the inner neighborhoods of Copenhagen has also declined quite a lot. There's also a small decline in members of the Danish National Church, and at the same time we're seeing that these Danish national churches, they're actually doing more and more activities. They're sort of pushing up the activity level, so they're spending more money, doing more activities for fewer and fewer people, and that of course means that the operating costs of running a church is skyrocketing, right? So it's a horrible business model right now. So what we did in this project was we did this huge report, which is unfortunately in Danish, and it looks at sort of a lot of questions regarding new use of Danish churches for other purposes than being churches. And then we did this idea catalog that looks closely at the 6 churches in Copenhagen that have closed, where we come up with 12 sort of fairly specific ideas for what you could reuse these churches for. And it's not like we're deciding what's going to happen to those churches, we're just providing the inspiration. Yeah, so the report looks at sort of, it does a sort of a typology of the Danish church buildings that I'm going to take you through in a minute. It looks at what's actually the operating costs of running a church building. How expensive is it? It's pretty expensive. We look at the legislation and framework conditions for actually using a church building for new purposes. There's all sorts of considerations that you have to look at. And then we look at international experiences, looking at cases from Holland and England to see how they've done it over there. Yes, so the big report divides the Danish national churches into 4 types. The village churches, the magnificent churches, I've called it in lack of a better word. If any of you have a better suggestion, please let me know. But in Danish it's called pragtkirker. And I couldn't find a meaningful translation. But they are really magnificent, and you'll see when I show you pictures. Then we have the city churches, which is probably very similar to the church we're in today. And then the suburban churches. So the village churches are relatively small. And they make up the larger part of the Danish church buildings. Like the name says, they're placed in villages in the rural areas of Denmark, and they're all built before the Reformation in 1536. They are Roman and Gothic in style. They're built in stone and brick. Very often they're surrounded by a churchyard and a churchyard wall, so they have sort of a closed structure. And 73% of the Danish churches, there are 2,350 Danish churches in total, if you look at the churches in the Danish National Church. So this would not be part of that number. But 73% of them are actually village churches. And the challenging thing with these churches is that if they're closed, if they're ever closed, they will automatically, as the law is now, they will automatically all be scheduled as monuments. De bliver fredet in Danish. Because of their high preservation value. Because they're middle-aged buildings. They're built before the Reformation in 1536. So any building in Denmark that's built before 1536 is automatically scheduled. The churches have been sort of outside of that law because they've been churches. But if they stop being churches, they sort of fall under the normal legislation and they'll be scheduled. And that, of course, presents a lot of challenges. If you want to reuse a scheduled building for a new purpose, there's sort of a lot of restrictions on what you can actually do to it physically. You can't transform it a whole lot. You can't make the windows bigger, or so there's a lot of challenges there. Right. Let me just see. Okay, I think I'll jump to the magnificent churches. They only make up 3% of the Danish churches. They're built between 1536 and 1849, and they're Renaissance and Baroque and Classicistic churches. They're often placed in larger cities. They're sort of spectacular buildings, or they're placed as sort of part of a castle building. And actually our report doesn't really deal that much with this type of church. We have described them, they're there. But as I said, it's only 3% of the Danish churches, and they are so sort of unique and exceptional examples of the many great architectural styles from the long period in which they were built. They all have this uniqueness to them, and they will probably not be closed in any foreseeable future because they're iconic, right? There's a picture here from Frederiksborg Castle Church, which would be a great example of a magnificent church like this. There's not much chance that Frederiksborg Castle Church will ever be turned into like a hotel, or because it has a great value being a church. So the city churches, much similar to this one, are relatively small. But the great thing about the city churches from a sort of a reuse perspective is that they often have a crypt or a cellar, like here. And they often have all these other extra rooms that you can actually use for other purposes. They're typically built between 1849 and 1930. And they are typically these historicistic and nationally romantic churches in red brick. They're often placed in smaller squares, or they're sort of built into the facade in the street. And yeah, like I said, they're fairly small, but they seem more spacious because they have these extra rooms. And the sort of the preservation value of the city church is sort of average, which is good because then you can use it for new purposes. It has a fairly high sort of environmental value because it's often a central point of orientation in the city, right? It's has a tower. You can see it from many places in the city, and it's often a building that's very good at creating this sort of intimate urban space. It's often placed out to, like you see on the picture here, a small square, and it sort of has this ambition to sort of reflect or recreate this intimate parish identity that you knew from the countryside. Recreate that in the big new neighborhoods in the city. So when people move from the countryside to, for example, Copenhagen in the mid-1800s, they wanted to sort of recreate that intimate feeling of their old church in the village. So they actually built these sort of intimate spaces around the church, which makes it a really nice urban space even today. They also have really sort of nicely well-proportioned rooms with fine detailing. It's a beautiful, beautiful rooms to step into often. The last type is the Suburban Church. It's a fairly large type of church, and it also typically has a lot of extra rooms. It's built after 1930. And it's often these quite modernistic buildings with offices and a lot of these extra rooms. They're built in open, designed spaces in the suburbs. They don't have a churchyard. They don't have any walls. They're often on this sort of green lawn area. And 9% of the Danish churches are suburban churches. So the preservation value of the suburban church is often quite low. It has some sort of environmental value with this open area around it, makes it a nice space. And it also tells like a physical story of the development of the welfare state in the post-war, where people moved to the suburbs. So it has some value, but and there are a few iconic suburban churches built by iconic architects that we would of course never consider closing, but on a sort of general level, the architectural value of these suburban churches are fairly low. Which of course also mean that you can, just go ahead and transform it really heavily. So looking a bit closer at the potential of the different types of churches, it's obvious that the city churches have a big potential for being transformed into new use, because they're centrally located in the cities. And they have these beautiful high ceiling spaces that I mentioned. This is a picture from Blågårds Church in Nørrebro in Copenhagen, one of the churches that have actually closed now. And one of the ideas that we came up with in the idea catalog was that maybe this church in Nørrebro could be reused as a common house for something called Copenhagen Food Community, where they could have their distribution central, and they could maybe run a small restaurant, and they could turn this place into a meeting place for the neighborhood, and sort of still keep the church building as a place for people to meet just around food and not religious worshipping, which sometimes overlaps today, I think. The suburban churches also have a big potential. They're placed in residential areas where people live. And because their sort of architectural value isn't that great, they can actually tolerate a higher degree of transformation. You can really move things around and put in extra floors. And one idea for this Baunehøj church, which is placed in something called Kongens Enghave in Copenhagen, was to actually turn it into a music house for the local kindergartens in the area, where they could come and play music and do gymnastics and rhythmic stuff. But another point to the suburban churches is that it's probably important, if you want to if it closes, and you have to consider what's going to happen to it, you have to actually consider whether it's worth transforming, because sometimes maybe it would be better from an aesthetic as well as a financial point to actually demolish it. Which would of course never happen to the village churches, as they're scheduled buildings. So the village churches have, as I've already mentioned, they have a fairly small potential for being reused. And that's because of the whole scheduled monument thing, but also because they're placed in rural areas in Denmark that are already suffering from an overload of empty buildings, right? They already have empty farming buildings and community centers and all these old sort of industrial buildings that they don't know what to do with, because people don't live there anymore. So another empty building in the shape of a church would just be, extra room to try to figure out what to do with. But if you had to reuse it for a new purpose, it would probably have to be something like the village hall, where people could gather for meetings and other stuff. It could be used as a concert hall, or maybe some play and sports activities that don't require that you do too much architectural change. We also in the report discuss this problem with the village churches and the lack of need in these rural areas for empty buildings, saying, so let's just imagine that 200 of these churches close down in Denmark. What are we going to do with them? If we can't find a new purpose, the best way of preserving an old building is to use it. If it's in use, someone will look after it, will make sure to repair it when it breaks and all that, But if it's just there empty, who's going to take care of it when it's not a church anymore? And we know that in England they have different organizations and trusts that actually take care of historic buildings of sort of national value, take care of them, preserve them, and sort of hold on to them until a new purpose has been found. So maybe that's what we have to do in Denmark as well. If we're ever going to close these village churches, maybe we have to look at them like these national historic monuments that we have to preserve, but they don't necessarily serve any particular function other than they're there for us to enjoy as a historic sort of memory. Yes. Another thing that we discuss in the report is this challenge that church buildings make up a particularly sensitive cultural heritage, right? When you come to someone and say, hey, we're going to close your church and turn it into a hotel or a community center, a lot of people will feel emotional about that, because this is a building and a room that represents something that's sacred to a lot of people. So what we've seen in looking at our different cases that we studied, we can see that it's a really good idea to leave room for sort of a period of mental maturing, where the community can sort of get used to the fact that something new is going to happen to this church building. Because it takes time to see the perspectives in a new use. And if you can find a way of involving the community in perhaps some sort of temporary activity, this can help with inspiration for what can this place be used for, and it can also help with this sort of mental maturing. So you gently ease people into that now your church is going to turn into something else. We saw it in an example from England in a church called St. Paul Old Fort, which was actually closed in 1991, and it took 13 years before they found a new purpose for the building. It was the local residents and the parochial church council, menighedsråd in Danish, that sort of joined forces in order to find a new function for the church, because they didn't want it to be demolished. And they did a lot of temporary activities in and around the church, and they sort of built this local support, and they also actually built enough sort of hype around the church building that they actually convinced foundations to support their project in the end. But it was a long stretch of time and work. Another thing we've also seen is that it's really important to have a sustainable operating model when you want to turn a church building into something else, because it's very expensive to rebuild an old church building. And if you don't have, a solid sort of business model for how you're going to run the thing afterwards, it's just going to be a big hole where you dropped all your money. And so we saw one really clever example where a council housing company bought a church in Holland, and they wanted to turn it into this sort of medical center with doctors and physiotherapists and nurses. But before they actually bought the church and started rebuilding it, they already made these contracts with 8 of the future 14 tenants or so. So they already had 8 smaller companies backing them up, saying, okay, when you finish this, we're ready to move in. Yes, another probably a bit more sort of an architectural point is that the way they did this transformation of this church is that they actually added a new sort of addition next to the church where they put a lot of offices. But you can see here down at this is the old church room, and they have some office buildings here sort of on the first level. And then down here at the end of the church, they have sort of an open space where they have a pharmacy. So when you walk into the church, even though they put this stuff here and this stuff here, you can actually still sort of look down through the room, and you can actually still sense that this used to be a church. So even though in theory they could just have crammed all these square meters with offices, they actually did a very sensible thing, and they built a small add-on where they put all the offices, so they could still preserve the qualities of this room. Another example of that is, and I don't know if you know this church, it's in Maastricht, and it's sort of one of the golden examples of how to reuse churches, right? It's a bookstore now, and we went to see it, and it is very, very spectacular. It's called the Polar Bookstore in Maastricht, and it's on the top 10 in the Guardian's list of most beautiful bookstores in the world, and I can totally understand that. And they told us that they have 800,000 yearly visitors every year that just drop by to see this place, and hopefully they buy a book or a pen while they're there. But as a tourist attraction, this is enormous. So that's quite amazing. And the point here is, of course, that this sort of unique aesthetic expression that a lot of church rooms have, it actually provides a really strong signaling effect for new users. So there's a lot of sort of branding and marketing value in putting your business into a spectacular room like this. And this is probably what helped sell this thing to the Polar bookstore chain, because they spend a lot of money making this store, but they certainly also got the payoff through 800,000 yearly visitors. And they did an amazing solution where they built this huge bookcase, the black structure that you see to the right. I think it's 2 or 3 stories high, and it sort of takes up the whole sort of right side of the church building, so it's quite big. But the architect that we met with, he told us that when he had to present this solution to the bookstore and to the municipality, he showed them a photo of Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe picture, right? You know the one? And he'd split it in half, so you could only see half of her face. And he said, "Can you see what this is?" And everybody said, "Yeah, it's Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe picture." And his point was that you can actually split the room with this large, big black bookcase, because you can still see the other half perfectly, and you're able to sort of, in your mind, to mirror what the church used to look like before you put this big black bookcase into it, because you still have one half that is completely original, and you can actually see all the way through down to the bottom of the building. Yeah, and I think it works really well. It's a very beautiful place. Also an example that it took a long time to find a new use for this building, because before, it's been used for all sorts of weird stuff, but before it was turned into a bookstore, it was actually just a place in the city where you could park your bike. Yeah, that's mental maturing for you. Another solution that we looked at is the Combi Solution, we called it, where you actually you only take the church out of use sort of partly. You don't close it down completely. It becomes sort of a half-time church. And we've seen that a lot in England, where they would actually transform a part of the church. Here in St. Paul Old Fort, they built this big wooden box inside the church room, quite beautiful, where they have offices and meeting rooms, and now they can sort of rent that space out for various associations and actually make some money to help support their church. That would be a little bit challenging in Denmark, because we have other sort of legal structures around that whole thing, so a Danish national church can't actually make money renting out space, but who knows what will be possible in the future. And they actually just sort of opened up for the solution that you can actually have non-church activities in a Danish national church now. You couldn't like a year ago, but you can now. Yes, just to sort of put two lines under that point, it's of course extremely important that when you transform a church room or when you add new structures in that church room, you consider the spatial qualities that are already in that room. I have two examples up here. One from a hotel in Holland, a rebuilt church that's now a hotel, where they've actually kept that open structure. Even though they put in a lot of new stuff, you can still totally sense sort of the length of the room. And then there's another example from another church in Holland that they turned into an office building. So when you walk into the church, this is actually pretty much what you see, this huge glass structure that sort of it takes up all the space. And I have some more photos. Yeah, so it's really hard when you go into St. Anna Kerk in Holland now. It's actually kind of hard to see that it used to be a church. They put a lot of square meters in there, and I think they have like 3 floors of office space. So they can put a lot of people in there, but it's not super nice actually. It seems a little bit cramped. I mean, they did the glass wall thing. They kept the new structure free of the original walls, which works okay, but still it's very compact. Yeah, and just to show you an example of, oh, this is bad. This is actually the ground floor of that church, but it feels like you're in a basement, and they can't rent out this space, which is not weird. And they even had extra windows put in over here to let in some more light, but you can see these are sort of the pillars of the church, and they have this low ceiling floor above, and it's not a nice room. The funky example is this hotel again in Maastricht in Holland, which was a complete delight to visit. A very beautiful, crazy place. They put a lot of work into designing special technical solutions that fitted perfectly with the building, that works and that are very discreet. I mean, they put smoke sensors up in the ceiling, so it sort of matched the already sort of the decoration, so you can hardly see that they're there. So that's one thing, and another thing is that this church actually used to be in a neighborhood in Maastricht that was kind of poor, worn down, not a nice place. This hotel chain invested all this money in rebuilding this church, and you can actually see that it's helped attract new investments to the area. New stores, new restaurants are popping up everywhere, and the city, the municipality, has also spent around 60 million euros actually sort of developing that neighborhood. So it's just to give an example of how a transformation of a unique building like this can actually help pull up a whole neighborhood. Yeah, just some more pictures from the hotel restaurant. That's actually, it's placed on a large box in the middle of the room, and that box is where they have all the technical stuff for running the kitchen, the light, the ventilation. So it's like 1 story high, and the restaurant is here, and you sit out here, you eat out here, and you get this amazing inflow of light, and the acoustics really nice, and it's just a very nice way of reusing that room. Yes. As a closing remark, I just want to say that a closed church building can still create value in the local community as a sort of a center for activities and for people to meet, even though it's not a church anymore. So, yeah, that was that.
Thank you very much.